He was tall, handsome, charming. Hollywood called him the perfect man. Women dreamed of him. Men admired him. Studios sold him as the ultimate American hero, the Marine-turned-actor who became a matinee idol. On screen, Rock Hudson was everything the golden age of cinema promised. Confident, magnetic, invincible. He was the star who made Doris Day laugh, who carried himself with the elegance of Cary Grant and the rugged strength of John Wayne. He wasn't just another actor. He was a symbol carefully sculpted into the fantasy of masculine perfection. But here's the part Hollywood never wanted you to see. Rock Hudson's life was not what it seemed. Behind those glossy movie posters and rehearsed interviews was a man trapped in a cage, one built not of steel bars, but of silence, lies, and an industry that would rather erase a person's humanity than admit an uncomfortable truth. Hollywood could tolerate scandal, affairs, even addiction. What it could not tolerate, at least in the 1950s and 60s, was Rock Hudson living openly as who he really was. The cage wasn't visible to the fans who lined up for tickets. They saw the tuxedos, the charming interviews, the whirlwind romances that appeared in magazines. They believed the staged photographs of Rock dining with glamorous actresses, the headlines calling him America's most eligible bachelor. They believed because they wanted to, and because Hollywood was determined to protect the illusion at any cost. But the man behind the illusion was carrying a weight so heavy it eventually consumed him. Rock Hudson knew that one wrong move, one slip, one whisper in the wrong ear could destroy everything. His career, his fortune, his reputation, his freedom. He lived constantly under that shadow, forced to perform not just on the set, but in his own life. Every smile had to look genuine. Every gesture had to pass as masculine enough. Every friendship, every relationship had to be carefully managed to keep suspicion away. The public adored Rock Hudson, but very few people truly knew Roy Scherer Jr., the boy from Winnetka, Illinois, who grew up lonely, abandoned by his father, and eventually reinvented by a ruthless Hollywood agent into the man the world knew as Rock. In the process of becoming a star, he was stripped of the right to live authentically. And when the truth finally broke loose, when the carefully polished image began to crack, it wasn't glamorous. It wasn't pretty. It was haunting. The revelation of Rock Hudson's real life didn't just shock his fans. It changed Hollywood. It changed America. And it changed the conversation about what it means to live with dignity in a world that refuses to accept you. Rock Hudson's story is more disturbing, more heartbreaking, and more important than the smiling photos suggest. Because it forces us to ask the question no studio press agent ever wanted raised. What does it cost to live a lie in plain sight? Rock Hudson wasn't born a star. He wasn't even born Rock Hudson. His real name was Roy Scherer Jr., and he entered the world on November 17, 1925 in Winnetka, Illinois, a quiet middle-class suburb of Chicago. His childhood was far from glamorous. His father, a struggling auto mechanic, abandoned the family during the Depression. His mother remarried, and Roy reluctantly took his stepfather's surname, Fitzgerald. The name never felt like his own. Neither, in many ways, did the life he was forced into. As a boy, Roy was shy and painfully self-conscious. He had trouble with school, sometimes forgetting lines during class recitations. But he found an escape in the movies. Sitting in darkened theaters, he saw Clark Gable, Gary Cooper, and Cary Grant projected as larger-than-life men. He imagined himself on that screen, tall, confident, admired. He was already tall, already handsome, but he lacked something Hollywood demanded: reinvention. When he moved to Hollywood after serving briefly in the Navy during World War II, his transformation began, not with his acting, but with his identity. He caught the eye of Henry Wilson, one of the most notorious talent agents in the business. Wilson had a unique specialty. He was a master sculptor of images, molding unknown young men into marketable, hyper-masculine stars. He was also infamous for controlling those men's personal and professional lives down to the smallest detail. Roy Scherer Jr. became Rock Hudson. The name itself was a creation designed to sound unbreakable. Rock, solid and dependable. Hudson, as vast and American as the river. It was a brand, not a birthright. With that signature, Roy disappeared, and Rock Hudson was born. But Wilson wasn't just selling a name. He was selling a fantasy. Every smile, every handshake, every photo spread in glossy magazines was carefully manufactured. Studio press agents staged candid shots of Rock arm in arm with beautiful starlets. When a camera snapped at a restaurant or a premiere, the woman on his arm wasn't coincidence, she was chosen. The dates were often arranged, sometimes lasting only long enough to walk past the flashbulbs. The public didn't care. They adored him. In the 1950s and 60s, Hudson skyrocketed to fame. He was cast in sweeping melodramas like Magnificent Obsession and All That Heaven Allows, romantic comedies opposite Doris Day, even war epics where he played the brave American soldier. His performances made him one of Universal's most bankable stars. At his peak, he was consistently ranked among the top 10 box office draws in America. Audiences saw him as the man every woman wanted and every man wanted to be. Confident, desirable, effortlessly masculine. Hollywood had created the perfect idol, and Rock Hudson played his part flawlessly. But beneath that polish, there was another truth. Rock Hudson was hiding a secret that Hollywood in those days refused to tolerate. His real identity, the one he couldn't show in public, the one he had to mask in every interview and every publicity stunt, was considered a career-ending liability. The higher he climbed, the more dangerous it became. Because the bigger the star, the more devastating the fall. Here's where the story turns darker. Rock Hudson was gay in an era when that single truth could end a career overnight. The 1950s weren't just conservative, they were brutal. In a time defined by Cold War paranoia and rigid social codes, being outed didn't just mean scandal, it meant total destruction. Careers vanished, contracts evaporated, reputations crumbled. It wasn't just whispers of gossip, it was exile. Henry Wilson, Hudson's agent, and the executives at Universal Studios knew it. And they weren't about to gamble with their most valuable star. So they built what can only be described as an airtight cage around him. A fortress of deception designed to protect the illusion at all costs. Studio press agents became his wardens. They meticulously arranged dates with glamorous actresses. If a premiere needed attention, Rock would be photographed walking hand in hand with a leading lady, a smile perfectly timed for the flashbulbs. The actresses knew their role. Rock knew his. It was performance layered on performance, a masquerade sold as reality. When rumors began to ripple too close to the surface, the studio machinery tightened. Journalists were bribed with exclusive scoops about other stars or threatened with being cut off entirely if they pursued the story. Editors understood the unspoken bargain. Play along with the myth, or risk losing access to Hollywood's golden boy. Still, the whispers grew. Then in 1955, with gossip threatening to explode, Rock Hudson was pushed into what insiders called a lavender marriage. His bride was Phyllis Gates, Henry Wilson's secretary. The marriage, short-lived and strained, was never about love. It was a cover, a carefully staged production meant to silence speculation and protect a multi-million-dollar career. To the public, it looked like a fairy tale. America's most eligible bachelor finally tamed. To Rock, it was another performance, another mask, another reminder of how trapped he was. But secrets, no matter how carefully guarded, never stay quiet forever. Rock Hudson learned to live a double life, slipping into hidden social circles where he could breathe if only for a moment. Friends from those circles would later describe the constant vigilance, the careful phone calls, the fear of being followed, the paranoia that a single careless word could unravel everything. Even in private, Rock played a role. He was never entirely free. He became Hollywood's paradox, its most beloved golden boy and its most carefully guarded prisoner. The public saw freedom, glamour, romance. Rock lived with anxiety, loneliness, and the suffocating knowledge that he was playing a part not just on screen but in his own skin. And as the years passed, the weight grew heavier. Every interview felt like a test. Every handshake felt like a risk. Every smile masked a man who knew that if the truth ever broke through the cage, Hollywood would rather bury him than accept him. The applause was real. The adoration was real. But the man behind it was locked away, waiting for a day he feared might never come. The day he could simply exist as himself. By the 1970s, Hollywood itself was changing. The polished studio system that had created Rock Hudson was collapsing. Audiences wanted something rawer, more rebellious. The clean-cut leading men of the 1950s looked old-fashioned compared to the anti-heroes of the new era. Actors like Al Pacino, Robert De Niro, and Jack Nicholson, who brought grit and realism to the screen. Rock Hudson, once the poster child of studio glamour, was suddenly a relic of an older Hollywood. He was still handsome, still charming, still a household name. But the machinery that had once kept his image untouchable was starting to break down. Tabloids were bolder now, willing to hint at what had once been off-limits. Late-night comedians made coded jokes about his bachelor lifestyle. Industry insiders whispered, and though the rumors rarely made it into mainstream headlines, they hung in the air like smoke. Rock handled it the only way he knew how, with charm and silence. He smiled through interviews, deflected questions, and leaned on the public's enduring affection. To fans, he was still Rock Hudson, dignified, charismatic, a living symbol of the Hollywood they remembered. But privately, the cracks in his carefully built facade were widening. Behind the scenes, Rock struggled. Relationships rarely lasted. The secrecy that had once protected him now left him isolated. Friends would later recall his loneliness, a man surrounded by fame yet unable to share his life openly. Every companion risked exposure. Every friendship had to be carefully managed. The toll of living in constant fear weighed heavier with each passing year. Professionally, his career was shifting too. The grand melodramas and romantic comedies that had made him a star were out of fashion. Rock found steady work on television, most notably in the detective series Macmillan and Wife, where he played a charming commissioner alongside Susan St. James. The show was successful, and audiences still adored him. But it was clear the myth of Rock Hudson, the untouchable golden boy, was fading. By the early 1980s, the transition was undeniable. Rock was no longer the box office king. He was a respected veteran, still admired, still in demand, but no longer the flawless image Hollywood had manufactured in the 1950s. And yet he carried with him the same secret, heavier now because time was running out. Then came the 1980s, and with it, a crisis unlike anything Hollywood had faced before. A silent epidemic was emerging, whispered about in hushed tones, dismissed by politicians, and sensationalized by tabloids. At first it seemed far away from the glossy world of movies, but soon it would land at the very center of American culture, and Rock Hudson would become its unwilling face. The irony was almost cruel. For decades, Rock had built a career on hiding the truth. Now a disease no one wanted to talk about would drag that truth into the open, in the most public and most painful way possible. The mask he had worn for so long was about to shatter, and the world was going to see the man behind it. In 1985, Rock Hudson appeared on American television to promote a new project, the ABC series Dynasty. For decades, he had been known for his towering presence, his movie star good looks, the image of strength and confidence. But what viewers saw on their screens that year was unrecognizable. Rock looked frail, his once broad frame now gaunt, his face hollowed by illness. The change was so stark, so unsettling, that speculation erupted almost immediately. Something was terribly wrong. Days later, the truth broke open. Rock Hudson had AIDS. That single announcement changed the course of history. Up until then, AIDS was often described in euphemisms like a mystery illness. It was whispered about in tabloids, sensationalized as a distant plague, and largely ignored by mainstream America. Politicians refused to say its name. News outlets danced around it. For most Americans, it was invisible, something happening somewhere else to someone else. But now it had a face. And not just any face, the face of Hollywood's golden age. The man who had defined masculinity for an entire generation was suddenly, publicly linked to a disease already carrying enormous stigma. It was the first time a major celebrity had gone public with the diagnosis, whether by choice or by the inevitability of the press. And it shattered the silence. The revelation sent shockwaves across the nation. Fans who had adored him for decades were stunned. To many, Rock Hudson was still the perfect man, the strong Marine, the romantic leading man, the fantasy America had embraced. To learn not only that he was ill, but that the illness was one tied to so much fear and prejudice, was almost unthinkable. It was unbelievable. It was heartbreaking. It was a truth America wasn't ready to face, but could no longer ignore. Even in sickness, Rock carried himself with dignity. He did not lash out at the press or retreat into total silence. Instead, he issued carefully worded statements acknowledging his illness. He did not ask for pity. He did not indulge in spectacle. Instead, he used what time and energy he had left to encourage compassion and to urge greater investment in research. He understood that his personal suffering had become something bigger, a turning point in a national conversation. His final months were painful. The man who had once been Hollywood's picture of health and vitality now struggled with weakness, hospital stays, and relentless public scrutiny. Yet in those months, he achieved something historic. Because in dying, Rock Hudson did what Hollywood had never allowed him to do in life. He told the truth. His name, his image, his very presence forced America to acknowledge a crisis it had tried to hide. The disease could no longer be whispered about. It had to be confronted. And in that confrontation, the myth of Rock Hudson became something greater than Hollywood ever scripted. Rock Hudson died on October 2, 1985, at just 59 years old. The news ricocheted across the globe. Newspapers printed it in bold type. Television anchors spoke his name with a mix of shock and sorrow. His passing wasn't just another Hollywood obituary. It was a cultural earthquake. For millions of Americans, his diagnosis and death put a human face on a crisis they had either ignored or misunderstood. AIDS was no longer a vague headline or an abstract fear, whispered about in the shadows. It was suddenly linked to someone they loved, someone they had admired on movie screens for decades. Rock Hudson's face, once synonymous with romance, masculinity, and glamour, now carried the weight of a disease the country had tried not to see. And that changed everything. Politicians who had avoided the topic were suddenly forced to address it. Celebrities who had stayed silent began to speak up. Charitable foundations gained momentum. Research funding that had been slow and reluctant started to grow. The stigma didn't vanish overnight, but the silence cracked, and into that silence rushed questions, debates, and slowly, painfully, a measure of compassion. Hudson's death also forced Hollywood to look in the mirror. For decades, the same industry that had made him a star had kept him in a cage. Executives, agents, and publicists worked tirelessly to sell an illusion of perfection while hiding the truth of who he was. They had used his face, his body, his image, while denying him the freedom to live authentically. And in the end, that cage consumed him. Today, when people hear the name Rock Hudson, they don't think only of the dashing leading man who lit up the screen in Pillow Talk or Giant. They also think of the man who in his final act gave visibility to millions who had none. His truth, revealed at the cost of his life, shifted an entire culture. He became a symbol not just of Hollywood glamour, but of courage. And yet there is a haunting truth we cannot escape. Rock Hudson never got to live as himself in the light of day. The applause, the staged romances, the kisses on screen, all of it was a performance scripted by others. Behind the curtain stood a man who wanted nothing more than to be free, to love openly, to live honestly. It's tempting to call his story tragic, and it is. But it's also transformative. In death, he accomplished what he was never allowed to in life. He forced the world to confront its prejudice and its silence. They called him Hollywood's perfect man, but perfection was the prison that killed him, and only in death did Rock Hudson finally tell the truth.